This is the fifth day of the impeachment inquiry into U.S. President Donald Trump. You have just been listening to the ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. He made an opening statement and has just been questioned by Adam Schiff, the leader of the House Intelligence Committee, the Democrats, and also the counsel for the Democrats as well. He made news. He said basically there was a quid pro quo. We've heard that phrase quite a bit. He used that exact phrase in his statement. He said it became clear to him that the only way Ukraine was going to get about $400 million in aid that had already been approved by both parties, the only way to get that aid was for Ukraine's new president, Zelenskyy, to make an announcement, not necessarily do an investigation, but make an announcement of an investigation into Burisma, a company that former Vice President Joe Biden's son was on the board. So basically an investigation into the Bidens. He also made clear that everyone was in the loop. Another exact quote, everyone was in the loop. Basically, that meant, he said, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at some point was aware of this. He referenced repeatedly Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, who was in charge, basically, of these efforts. Secretary of Energy Rick Perry as well, Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, that is. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton, Kurt Volker, who also testified, former special envoy to Ukraine. He testified yesterday, and he implied that at some point, Vice President Mike Pence also became aware. So let's go ahead and play just a bit of the testimony of Ambassador Gordon Sondland. Let's listen.
This is not my first time cooperating with this committee. As you know, I've already provided 10 hours of deposition testimony, and I did so despite directives from the White House and the State Department that I refuse to appear, as many others have done. I agreed to testify because I respect the gravity of the moment, and I believe I have an obligation to account fully for my role in these events.
And just to let everyone know where things stand right now, this is just a quick 5-minute break before the Republicans get a chance to question the ambassador. Kimberly Halkett is following the developments outside of the White House. We're going to speak to Kimberly in just a moment. First, let's go to Heidi Zhou-Castro, who's just outside the chambers where this hearing is being held, where they're on a quick 5-minute recess. It's been quite a morning there in Washington, Heidi.
That's right. It's been quite a morning, with Gordon Sondland starting his testimony by saying, yes, there was absolutely an explicit quid pro quo, referencing that there was a White House meeting dangled for President Zelenskyy, an invitation for him to meet with Trump. And Sondland said that it was very clear that the president was not going to allow Zelenskyy to visit without launching investigations, without Ukraine announcing it wasn't launching investigations into Joe Biden. But then it gets even more interesting when Sondland goes further and talks about the second quid pro quo that has been alleged here, that being that Trump also was withholding the military aid to Ukraine in exchange for the public announcement of those investigations. And Sondland has very carefully worded testimony here. I know you read some of his exact quotes out loud, but others that struck me was Sondland said it was, quote, common knowledge that these two things were linked, that the aid and the statement for the investigations into the Bidens were conditioned. And he said that it was absolutely conditioned. And this is how he explained his reasoning leading him to that conclusion.
I was adamantly opposed to any suspension of aid, as the Ukrainians needed those funds to fight against Russian aggression. I tried diligently to ask why the aid was suspended, but I never received a clear answer. Still haven't to this day. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 elections and Burisma as Mr. Giuliani had demanded.
You can really tell how he's trying to thread the needle there, Rochelle, because he also, under questioning, said something that appears to be supportive of the president. Another quote, "I never heard from President Trump that aid was conditioned on an announcement of the investigations," referencing at that point the phone conversations that Sondland had with President Trump. He was asked specifically about a conversation in early September, which occurred right after it was brought to his attention that there was alarm among the other U.S. Ambassadors, saying that it was crazy that it appeared that this aid was linked to the political investigations. Well, Sondland testified that he called Trump in the middle of the night then, got a very sour Trump who was in a bad mood. And when Sondland asked Trump, "What is it that you do want?" he said that the president's words were, "I want nothing. I do not want a quid pro quo, but Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, should, quote, do the right thing." So Sondland is saying that affirmed what his analysis of the situation was already at that point, that the security aid and that the investigations into the Bidens were tied.
So, Heidi, this is a lot of what Sondland is saying. It is new information. You could maybe, depending on how you describe it, you can say he's updating his testimony, changing it. But as you said, a lot of this is contradictory to the 10 hours of deposition that he already gave. He tried to say or insinuate that some of that is because he wasn't able to get his documents from the State Department because they won't allow him to. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's something that Adam Schiff referenced as well, that none of the documents that the committee has requested has the White House turned over.
That's right. It's interesting because Sondland has been sort of all over the place on his testimonies, reversing himself in the past. But today we heard him lay the blame also at the feet of the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, saying that the State Department has not allowed him to access records of his conversations, other documents that Sondland says he needs to refresh his apparently not great memory. And further drawing Pompeo into the mix, Sondland testified that he got messages from Pompeo throughout his dealings with Ukraine, encouraging him, saying that he was doing a great job and that he should keep at it. It's interesting to think what the motivation here is for Sondland. Is he trying to shift some of this responsibility toward his superiors in order to dig himself out of the legal pit that he might find himself in? It's interesting. He notably doesn't take the blame for any of what he's saying happened. He blames Rudy Giuliani, the private attorney of President Trump, for what Sondland says has been this insidious campaign trying to get those investigations out of Ukraine and putting more and more as leverage from the U.S. First, the White House meeting for Zelenskyy, and later the security aid destined for Ukraine. And then he blames Pompeo for apparently not telling Sondland that he was doing anything wrong, for rather encouraging him as Sondland was having these meetings with Ukrainian officials and making those explicit demands, saying if you don't give up those the public announcement of the investigations, you will not be getting the security aid from the U.S. The bigger question is how much blame does he put at the feet of President Trump? And notably, he seems to be the most tight-lipped when he's asked that question. Rochelle.
Okay, Heidi, keep us posted there from Capitol Hill. Let's go now to the White House, our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, the key words from Ambassador Sondland: "I followed the directions of the president," talking about the man in the House right behind you. That seems to be the beginning and end of all of this. What do we know about what the White House is watching, is paying attention to?
Well, the U.S. president is expected to leave the White House momentarily. He's trying to shift directions away from the headlines in Capitol Hill to Austin, Texas, where he's headed to tout creation of jobs at an Apple plant that he says is a direct benefit as a result of his policies. But there's no question that what most people are going to be focusing on is this testimony that has just taken place on Capitol Hill. And I should note in the last few minutes, as you were talking with our correspondent Heidi Zhou-Castro, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, spoke to reporters very briefly. I did manage to catch a feed of some of that coming from Capitol Hill, and he said that essentially this testimony speaks to the heart of the issue of bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. There's no question that the sort of the allegations that have been put forward by Gordon Sondland, the ambassador to the European Union, really has implicated not just the U.S. president, but also the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence. And as a result, Adam Schiff going on to say just moments ago that there's no question that this is why they do not want these documents public, that they have been attempting to obstruct this investigation because of their firsthand knowledge of the scheme. So given those statements, it's pretty unusual that the House Intelligence Chair was speaking in the midst of proceedings to reporters. They seem to believe, judging from that language, that this is a pivotal moment as we're on day 4 of these public hearings. So now we're watching very carefully to see what the President of the United States is going to say. It's notable that he is leaving his departure to later in the day, perhaps watching these proceedings. We do know that he watched them yesterday. And in advance of Ambassador Sondland's testimony, the president sent out a tweet saying that there was a lot of confidence coming from the White House. In fact, during these proceedings, the press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, also sent out a text saying there is a stark difference between truth and opinion. Truth derives sustenance from facts, whereas opinion is a judgment influenced by prejudices. Apologies. She goes on with the hashtag impeachment circus. So the Republicans, defenders of the president, seem to be trying to make the case that this is a circus, that this is statement not backed up by fact. It's going to be very, very hard to do that moving forward, given the testimony that we've just heard from the ambassador to the European Union.
And given the fact that so much of the testimony from various people, Kimberly, it matches up, it lines up. And it seems that the White House in the past has questioned a lot of things, questioned the loyalty of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, has tried to paint people as never Trumpers. Ambassador Gordon Sondland doesn't fit a never Trumper. Tell us a little bit more about him.
Well, the fact of the matter is that he's a major Republican donor. So that makes it pretty challenging, given the fact that essentially he's one of the president's own. So the fact that he is saying all of this makes it that much more difficult now for Republicans to defend. We heard in the opening statement from Devin Nunes, where he essentially tried to characterize this, even using some of the language that we've heard from Democrats, alleging them that they had a sort of debunked conspiracy theory with regard to quid pro quo. Well, the problem is that it's not a debunked conspiracy theory if Gordon Sondland's actually testifying that that's exactly what it was, quid pro quo. So it's going to make that defense very difficult. And given the fact that now there has also been testimony that there was knowledge of the scheme that extended far and wide, sort of to the outer corners of the White House, the State Department, the Vice President's office, despite denials in the past, it's going to be difficult to counter this. Now, the reason the White House had been confident up to this point is they felt that they had gotten something very positive from the hearings on Tuesday afternoon. Kurt Volker, for example, that was mentioned throughout this testimony, had essentially done something positive for the president, said that there was no quid pro quo. So now we've got these two statements that directly contradict one another. It's going to be up to the Republicans now moving forward to try and dissect that. But given the fact that we have new details from Gordon Sondland, given the fact that he is a Republican donor to President Trump, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish that task.
Okay, Kimberly Halkett, following all of this from the White House. Kimberly, thank you. We'll get back to you. Let's bring Steve Clemons into the conversation, the host of The Bottom Line, Al Jazeera's weekly political show. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Steve, this feels like an inflection point today.
It's a huge earthquake. The hearing in part began with the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, warning Ambassador Sondland that the Democrats were going to smear his reputation. That didn't happen. And now you wonder what's happened. This was Gordon Sondland moving and shifting just like Kurt Volker. Ambassador Volker shifted yesterday. These were two moves I think the Republicans did not expect. And you do feel as if the teeter-totter has now gone the other direction. And so I think this is staggeringly important. I think his testimony was electric and powerful and blunt. And on the issue of the ecosystem around the president and what everyone thought was essentially a quid pro quo, we now don't have any ambiguity as far as this testimony is concerned.
So when you talk about the president's ecosystem, yes, Gordon Sondland said everyone was in the loop about what was going on. He also does, this phrase is interesting, it was a continuum of insidiousness. He said that back in May, it started with these generic requests on behalf of President, perhaps through Rudy Giuliani, for there to be some sort of investigations into corruption, generally speaking. And then he says it became more and more clear that this was specifically about getting the president of Ukraine to make an announcement, not necessarily the investigation, but an announcement of an investigation into Burisma and into the Biden. So he said it became more and more clear. And then he says eventually he started to realize that the release of the aid, the $400 million, was contingent upon all of this happening. And he made it clear that so many people knew about this. What does this say? How much bigger is this, Steve, if everything that I just said is something that the president's chief of staff was aware of, the secretary of state was aware of, the secretary of energy was aware of, the former national security advisor was aware of? What does it say that potentially all of these people knew this was happening?
With Richard Nixon, some of the movies and books that followed that by Woodward and Bernstein were called All the President's Men. In this case, I think you could call it All the President's People. Essentially around him were either trying to enact what the president wanted, which was this quid pro quo, a deal with Zelenskyy that he would make a public announcement of this investigation into the Bidens and Burisma, and then the aid would be released, or there were members in the administration, like John Bolton, like Fiona Hill, like Colonel Vindman and others, that were blowing the whistle and saying this was wrong, inappropriate. All of these people were not Democrats challenging Donald Trump. There is a divide that's very interesting between those who thought they were just carrying out the president's orders and those inside who said this is inappropriate behavior, but they all belong to the president's team. And that is what we're seeing play out today. And I think that's what's so interesting. And it will be interesting to see how the Republicans defend this, because in the past, in the testimony that we heard the other day from Ambassador Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent, you had a case where they were being challenged that maybe they didn't hear or see what they thought they did. Mm-hmm. Now that has been removed. And I think what it says to your question is, it means that we've got a validity, a solvency to these claims that the president wanted this. And it's going to be very, very hard, I think, for the Republicans to dispute that. And I think now we'll probably see an evolution in this discussion to, okay, maybe the president did want that. It's still not impeachable. But we'll see.